Hey there, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Tonight's episode is not for the faint of heart. We're diving deep into the terrifying, brutal, and downright bizarre world of medieval crime and punishment. This video is all about what happened when you broke the rules back then, and trust me, even breathing wrong could count. Steal a loaf of bread, you might lose a hand. Talk back to a noble? Hope you like branding irons. Get falsely accused? That's too bad. Because justice in the Middle Ages didn't care about innocence, just spectacle. Now, think about how crime works today. You get a lawyer, you go to court, there's paperwork, rights, maybe even a second chance. But back then, your trial might involve boiling water, trial by fire, or a duel to the death. And if you lost, well, let's just say the public execution was the original live stream event. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners. And it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. It genuinely means so much to me to see people from every continent joining in, curious, open-minded, and just as obsessed with history's shadowy underbelly as I am. Now, let's begin. Why being a medieval criminal was a death sentence. You didn't mean to become a criminal. Really? You were just hungry. That half-loaf of rye bread sitting unattended on the merchant's cart? It looked like it wanted to be stolen. One snatch, a few steps, and bam, caught. Maybe by a town guard who was actually awake for once, or a nosy vendor who screamed loud enough to raise the entire street. Either way, you're surrounded, and no one's asking questions. In fact, no one seems interested in whether or not you did it at all. The baker is yelling, the guard is already tying your wrists, and the crowd is circling like wolves that skipped breakfast. Welcome to your arrest. In the Middle Ages, where the idea of due process was still fermenting in the back of a goat shed, you're not being told your rights because you don't have any. You're not getting a lawyer because that profession hasn't been invented in any useful way for someone like you. You're just a poor soul caught doing something, anything, that society deemed wrong. Stealing, sin, talking back, sin, practicing herbal remedies your grandmother taught you, triple sin, in a world run by superstition, divine law, and the ever-watchful eye of whoever wants your land. Almost anything can land you in chains. And that's exactly where you are now, chained, cold, and being dragged through muddy streets as spectators point and laugh, already assuming your guilt. Because in their eyes, if you're tied up, you must have done something. And even if you didn't, your fear is entertaining. Your first stop? Maybe a dungeon. Maybe a makeshift holding pen behind the church. Maybe just a stool in the public square, where villagers can throw spoiled vegetables at your face while waiting for your trial. And you're not the only one. Children as young as 10, elders bent double with age, women just trying to survive. All have found themselves right where you are. The law isn't designed to protect people. It's designed to protect power. If you're poor, foreign, outspoken, or unlucky, justice doesn't bother with explanations. It just happens to you. Harshly. Suddenly. Often fatally. What's worse, you can be arrested for crimes you didn't even know were crimes. You thought it was harmless to pick a few herbs at dusk? Boom. Witchcraft. You were late on your taxes? That's fraud, punishable by flogging or worse. Looked a noble in the eye while they passed you in the market? That's called disrespect, and might cost you a tooth. The law is a shifting beast, and it always hungers for new prey. And once you've been arrested, your fate is already halfway sealed. The town square awaits. The stocks are being dusted off, and somewhere, an executioner is flexing his grip. So, no, you didn't mean to be a criminal. But in this world, meaning doesn't matter. Only guilt, real or assumed. And either way, you're already on the road to punishment. In the medieval world, breathing was legal. Barely. Everything else? Potentially a crime. Laws weren't carved in stone. They were more like moldy suggestions that could mutate depending on who was in charge, what mood they were in, or whether the local priest woke up on the wrong side of his straw mattress. Want to gather firewood to survive the winter? Illegal if the forest belongs to the Lord. Catch a fish from the stream to feed your starving child? That's poaching. Prepare to lose a hand. Say something snide about the king's new tax policy. That's treason. You didn't need to be a criminal mastermind to run afoul of the law. You just needed to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. The list of crimes was long, vague, and terrifyingly elastic. Blasphemy, heresy, gossip, adultery, slander, idleness, suspicious behavior, and looking unwomanly could all earn you a fast track to public punishment. And by public, we mean everyone in your village invited to throw things at your face while you're locked in the pillory. Want to escape? Tough. That's resisting arrest. Try to defend yourself? Now you're attacking an officer of the law, even if said officer is just a glorified pig farmer with a wooden stick and a thirst for power. And heaven help you if you were born with a birthmark or an unusual eye color. That's witchcraft, straight to trial, no spells required. Your social status also decided what was or wasn't a crime. If a nobleman burned your house down in a drunken rage, well, that's just boys being boys. But if you accidentally stepped on his land while chasing your goat, you've just committed trespass, a finable offense if you're lucky. If you're not, it's jail, flogging, or a branding iron sizzling your name into the criminal hall of shame. Being poor didn't just make life harder, it made it criminal. The less you had, the more punishable your existence became. Even accidents could get you executed. Let a cart roll downhill and break someone's leg, that's bodily harm, punishable by losing your own limb. Forget to bow during a church procession, that's sacrilege. A sin against God and the state, and trust me, they don't forgive easily. Because every crime was viewed through a lens of religion, authority, and suspicion. You weren't just breaking laws, you were defying the divine order. So if you think you're safe because you're a good person, think again. In the Middle Ages, being good wasn't protection. It was a liability. The more people liked you, the more they noticed you. And the more they noticed you, the more likely someone was to whisper your name into the ears of power. That whisper could become an accusation. And that accusation, your ticket to a punishment far worse than the crime. In medieval Europe, the law didn't protect you. It didn't even pretend to. It was less a shield and more a guillotine waiting to drop. Modern law has flaws, sure, but at least it tries. There are books, standards, debates, even some sense of equality in theory. Back then, the law was an extension of whoever held the most power, drank the best wine, or had the loudest whisper in the Lord's ear. Written laws existed, yes, but they were as flexible as a wet parchment scroll and just as readable to the average peasant. Most people were illiterate, which meant they had no clue what the law actually said. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Knowing the law didn't help when the guy enforcing it had a personal grudge and a sword. Your judge could be the local lord, who's been feuding with your family for 3 generations. Or maybe it's a bishop who thinks your habit of questioning things is blasphemous behavior. There's no jury, no appeal. Just a verdict delivered by someone who might be drunk, hungover, or bored, and your fate depends on whether he thinks watching your punishment will brighten up his week. If you're lucky, you'll get a public scolding and maybe a fine you can't pay. If you're not, you'll be strung up in the town square by sunset. Mercy isn't written into the system. It's a rare, unpredictable mood swing. There was also no separation between civil and religious law. God's rules were the state's rules, and breaking them could land you in hell and on the execution block at the same time. Maybe you didn't attend church last Sunday because your child was dying. Doesn't matter. That's a sin of omission, and sins have consequences. The law treated divine failure the same way it treated criminal behavior, with punishment. Everything was black and white, and usually stained red by the end. And corruption? Oh, it was baked in like a stale loaf of rye bread. Bribes weren't just common, they were expected. Can't pay? Then you'd better enjoy the smell of burning flesh, because a few missing coins might cost you your skin. Wealthy people rarely faced the full force of the law. They had coin, land, and leverage. You had your fingers crossed and maybe a rabbit's foot, assuming it wasn't also considered a pagan talisman, which of course was a crime. So, no, the law was not your friend. It didn't listen, it didn't care. It existed to maintain power, and if that meant crushing you under the weight of your own poverty, or punishing you to send a message to the rest of the town, so be it. Justice wasn't blind. It stared straight at your ragged shoes and decided you weren't worth saving. Here's the bad news. Literally anyone. In the Middle Ages, the accusation itself was often more powerful than the truth. Your neighbor, who's still bitter about that time your chicken wandered into his garden, could point a finger and whisper your name to the wrong person. That's it. You're now under suspicion. Did he see you muttering near the well at night? Clearly, you were casting a spell. Did you refuse to sell him eggs last week? Must be a heretic move. Welcome to the beginning of your downfall, powered by petty grudges, paranoia, and a total lack of evidence. Children could accuse adults. Servants could accuse masters. Strangers who'd never met you could decide you looked suspicious and seal your fate with a few vague words and an exaggerated tale. Sometimes the person accusing you did it to save themselves from suspicion. Caught with stolen apples? Blame your neighbor. Someone's goat died mysteriously? Must be witchcraft, surely performed by that old woman who keeps to herself and owns too many cats. And once your name's out there, no one wants to be the person who defended a potential criminal. Even your friends will start avoiding eye contact. Guilt by association is very much in fashion. You didn't get to face your accuser in court. Often, you didn't even know who it was. Some accusations were anonymous, others were delivered during church confessions and passed along by clergy acting as divine mail carriers. But the most terrifying part? Some accusations came from dreams. Literally. If someone dreamt that you were consorting with the devil, that was considered spiritual evidence. Hearsay wasn't dismissed, it was welcomed, especially if it was dramatic. And if multiple people accused you, game over. The court saw consensus as proof. It didn't matter if they were all your jealous rivals or people who didn't understand how illness works and assumed your herbal teas were dark magic. In a town of 200 people, mass suspicion spread like plague, and it was just as fatal. This culture of accusation didn't just create fear, it created silence. People kept to themselves, avoided attention, and trusted no one. It fractured communities and fed into cycles of violence, gossip, and death. Because once someone says your name with enough conviction, the system isn't interested in hearing yours. Innocent until proven guilty is a modern luxury. A legal pearl polished over centuries of reform, logic, and just enough human decency to get us here. But back in the Middle Ages, That concept was as foreign as indoor plumbing. Guilt was not something the court needed to prove. It was something you had to claw your way out of while bleeding, freezing, and possibly tied to a chair. Accusation itself was halfway to a conviction. You were assumed guilty, and the burden of proving your innocence often required miracles. And even then, don't hold your breath. There was no forensic evidence, no CCTV, no sworn affidavits. Just your word against theirs. And if theirs came from a noble, priest, or someone with better shoes than you, guess who the court believed. Spoiler: it wasn't the muddy peasant shivering in rags. Even worse, silence was considered suspicious. If you didn't defend yourself loud enough or convincingly enough, it was seen as confirmation of guilt. But defend yourself too loudly? That was aggression, a sign you were trying to cover something up. Every move, every word, every breath was interpreted against you. Your defense might involve an oath, but even that had rules. You needed oath helpers, basically character witnesses, who'd swear that you were a decent human being. Problem is, those oath helpers had to be accepted by the court. If your friends were too poor, too old, or too female, their words didn't count. And if you couldn't find enough people to swear on your behalf, that wasn't seen as lack of social connections. It was seen as evidence that everyone knew you were guilty. The system didn't want your side of the story. It wanted a scapegoat. Sometimes the court wouldn't even wait for the full hearing. Suspicion alone could lead to preventive justice, a polite term for torture, isolation, or branding before any formal judgment had been passed. And once that mark was on you, socially or physically, good luck shaking it off. Even if you were miraculously declared innocent, you'd still carry the shame. People would still avoid you. Children would whisper. Shopkeepers might refuse service. Because where there's smoke, there's fire, right? And you were now permanently smoky. The entire system was designed to reinforce power and prevent disruption. Justice wasn't about truth, it was about control. Making sure people feared stepping out of line. And what better way to do that than to prove that innocence wasn't enough? That even a clean heart and a loyal life meant nothing once someone accused you of stepping into the wrong forest, or glancing the wrong way during Mass. In the Middle Ages, innocence wasn't your shield. It was a joke, told at your expense. Forget separation of powers. Forget legal checks and balances. In medieval Europe, the law was often just one man, your local lord. He could be a baron, a bishop, or some half-literate landholder whose qualifications included a title, a grudge, and the ability to swing a sword without tripping over his own ego. This was the person who decided whether you lived, died, paid a fine, or got tossed into a pit until your bones made their own decisions. There were no neutral courts. The judge was your master, literally. Your lord didn't need a degree or legal training. His authority came from bloodline, birthright, and a divine blessing rubber-stamped by the church. His word was law. He could make it up on the spot, and you'd better hope you weren't standing in the wrong place when he did. Maybe he just lost a wager. Maybe his wife yelled at him during breakfast. Maybe he tripped over your dog, doesn't matter. If he said you were guilty, the scribes wrote it down and the guards made it real. Appealing his decision? Sure, if you felt like riding for 10 days to a higher court you couldn't afford and wouldn't survive reaching. These lords didn't just punish, they profited. Fines for crimes went straight into their coffers. Confiscated property? That's now part of the estate. Your barn, your tools, maybe even your family goat, all now belong to Lord Harold the Unjust. He could sentence you and then benefit directly from your suffering. Conflict of interest wasn't a problem, it was the entire point. The more accusations, the more revenue, the more fear, the more obedience. And in villages where one man controlled the land, the law, and your ability to exist, obedience was non-negotiable. Even justice rituals reinforced his power. Trials were held in his hall, punishments happened in his square. He sat in a big wooden chair while you knelt in dirt. Your fate might be decided under the same roof where his dogs sleep and his stew boils. And don't think for a second that fairness factored in. If you were a woman who rejected a noble's advance, or a serf who asked too many questions about taxes, the law became very interested in your sudden moral failure. The Lord might even have a personal executioner, a man whose only job was to carry out the master's will, and he rarely missed a day of work. So no, the local lord wasn't your protector. He was the storm cloud you lived under. The one who could decide that today, justice meant flogging, and tomorrow it meant fire. He didn't just rule your land, he ruled your breath, your silence, your survival. And if you ever forgot that, the law was waiting, right outside your door, sharpening a blade. When you're dragged into medieval custody, no one calmly recites your rights, because you don't have any. There's no parchment scroll stating you're entitled to a fair trial, no guarantee of legal representation, and certainly no comforting sentence that ends with, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The only thing being used against you is your existence. You're not a citizen. You're property. You're not protected by the system. You are the system's next offering. The closest you'll get to a right is the right to remain terrified. The guards don't need a warrant. They don't even need a reason. Maybe someone saw you out after curfew. Maybe the local priest thinks your beard is too foreign. Maybe your neighbor just wants your plot of cabbage and decided to call you a thief. That's enough. You're hauled into the Lord's court or the church's cellar, given no explanation, and expected to explain yourself. Which is ironic because they haven't told you what you're accused of. And if you ask, that's seen as defiance. If you plead ignorance, well, that's its own crime. Playing dumb is considered evasive. Trying to defend yourself without training is called arguing. Staying silent is labeled suspicious. The very act of surviving the accusation turns into a gauntlet of missteps, where each response is somehow proof of guilt. It's Kafka before Kafka was born. A trap disguised as a legal system. There's no guarantee you'll even live long enough to be heard. The idea of keeping you alive for your trial? Optional. Some accused never even see a judge. They're handled before that. A polite way of saying, forgotten in a dungeon until death or confession. No record, no closure. Just cold stone, shackles, and rats curious about your remaining fingers. And if, by some miracle, you're granted a hearing, the trial itself isn't built for clarity. You might be too weak from malnourishment or infection to speak. No one checks on that. No one checks on you. You're a body filling a quota. Another case to be processed, not a person to be heard. The idea of legal rights doesn't exist because you're not seen as worthy of them. The people with rights are the ones wearing silk, not straw. So when you get arrested in the Middle Ages, forget everything you've learned about modern justice. You don't get a phone call. You don't get a lawyer. You don't get a second chance. What you get is silence. Brutal, deafening silence, and the heavy sound of a door closing behind you. For the last time. Confessing to a crime you didn't commit sounds ridiculous until you're living it. In medieval Europe, confession wasn't just evidence. It was the finish line, the golden ticket for your captors. The moment you finally said the words they wanted to hear, the entire charade could wrap up with a bow and a blade. And if you refused to confess, they'd help you along. gently at first, then less gently, then violently, until the only thing left was your broken body mumbling whatever they needed you to say. Confession wasn't extracted with logic. It was extracted with tools. Thumbscrews, iron boots, weighted racks, devices that twisted, crushed, stretched, and shattered, carefully calibrated not to kill you, but to break you just enough that you'd wish for death. The longer you resisted, the more inventive they became. Heated tongs, splintered wedges hammered beneath your fingernails, water poured down your throat until your lungs stopped being lungs and became sacks of fire and panic. It didn't matter how strong your will was. Everyone breaks eventually, and when you do, they write it down and parade it through town as proof. A confession freely given. Emphasis on freely, because irony was apparently their favorite seasoning. Even if you managed to endure the worst of it and still refused, they'd just shift strategy. Maybe threaten your family, accuse your children, suggest your pregnant wife might also be hiding some heretical leanings. And if you still didn't budge, sleep deprivation, darkness, isolation. You'd sit in silence so long your thoughts would scream. Days, weeks, maybe even months, until the line between truth and survival disappeared completely. And here's the twisted masterpiece of it all. The confession didn't always save you. Sometimes it led straight to the scaffold or the pyre, but it made their job easier. Your soul was now considered redeemable because you admitted your sins. You became a cautionary tale wrapped in ashes, a public example of repentance through pain. Everyone wins except you. Confession wasn't the end of the process. It was the justification, a stamp of legitimacy on an illegitimate system. They weren't torturing you. They were helping you purge evil, helping you cleanse your soul, helping you become spiritually worthy of the punishment they were about to deliver. In their eyes, this was mercy. And in the Middle Ages, mercy was just torture with good PR. It's not a room, it's a stone box, cold, damp, and echoing with the cries of those who screamed here before you. The interrogation chamber isn't lined with shelves of legal books or a table with a pitcher of water and a notepad. There's no two-way mirror, no interview. What you have is a low ceiling, dripping walls, flickering torches, and tools on hooks that don't belong in any civilized conversation. You don't sit across from your accuser. You sit under them, shackled, bloodied, barefoot. Interrogation in the Middle Ages wasn't about information. It was about breaking you. There is no truth that cannot be discovered with enough pressure. The interrogators already believe you are guilty. What they want is your agreement, and they'll take it however it comes. Through words, sobs, screams, or incoherent gasps. It starts with questions, simple ones, delivered softly, a false sense of control. Where were you on the night of... But it doesn't matter what you say, because the next question will be louder, and the one after that will be shouted into your face as your arms are stretched by a winch or your ankles twisted into positions nature never intended. You try to hold out. You remind yourself of your innocence. But pain doesn't care about morality. Pain doesn't negotiate. You lose track of the questions. You forget what day it is. You forget your own name. The torturer doesn't stop unless told to, or unless your body finally gives out. Sometimes a priest stands nearby, reading scripture while your fingers are crushed beneath iron. This is called divine interrogation. Because God, they claim, wants the truth. But deep down, you know, God isn't here. Only metal and bone, creaking wood and hot breath. Interrogation was a performance, and you were the main act. designed to terrify everyone else into obedience. Maybe there were onlookers. Maybe your cries were encouraged to echo outside, drifting through the market square, a soundscape of consequence. And even if you survived, and that's a generous if, your mind never fully returns. People don't leave the interrogation room. They're scraped off the walls and pieced back together like shattered pottery, badly, and never quite the same. The goal wasn't truth. It was submission. And admission was merely a formality, proof that the system worked, even if it crushed 100 innocents along the way. And tomorrow, someone else will sit where you are now. Because there's always another confession waiting to be pulled out like a tooth, with force, sweat, and the sound of a soul tearing loose. Yes, art. Because in the Middle Ages, torture wasn't just a method. It was an expression of power, control, and dark creativity. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, practiced, rehearsed across generations, and codified into a grim symphony of suffering. Every device had a name, every punishment had a purpose, and every torturer considered himself a craftsman, a sculptor of pain. Let's begin with the classics, the rack. A wooden frame designed to stretch your body until tendons snapped and joints popped like firewood in the hearth. You weren't just pulled apart. You were deconstructed, limb by limb, thought by thought, until your body no longer felt like yours. Or take the iron boot, a metal casing clamped around your leg and slowly tightened with wedges. The pressure would pulverize your shin bone into a mush of blood and splinters, each new turn greeted with the music of your own screams. Then came the pear of anguish, a deceptively floral-sounding implement inserted into the mouth or elsewhere and twisted open, for liars, heretics, or anyone accused of indecent behavior. And the infamous scavenger's daughter, a folding frame that crushed your body into itself, forcing blood to rush from every orifice. It wasn't just pain, it was grotesque choreography, a ballet of torment, flaying, branding, boiling, sleep deprivation, starvation with just enough water to keep you conscious. The idea was to break you down, not instantly, but slowly, meticulously, like peeling an onion made of flesh. Public or private, it didn't matter. The tools changed, but the goal remained. Compliance, fear, submission. Torture was both punishment and prevention, a way of saying, this is what happens when you stray. Some methods were so perverse they bordered on surreal, like being sewn into a sack with a rooster and a snake, then tossed into a river, or forced to stand barefoot on hot coals while reciting prayers, each stumble seen as a sign of guilt. It wasn't science, it wasn't justice, it was theater, ugly, brutal, and universally understood. The torturers themselves were not demons in human skin. They were hired men, often respected in their communities. Their work was seen as necessary, even noble. After all, they were the hands of law, and their artistry just doing what must be done. You could try to bribe them, you could try to beg. But once they began, there was no rewind, only progression, and the unrelenting symphony of blood and screams that echoed through their grim little workshops. Because in the Middle Ages, pain wasn't a side effect of justice. It was justice. So you've been accused of a crime, and the Lord, or maybe the village priest, has generously offered you a chance to prove your innocence. No lawyer, no evidence, no defense strategy, just you, your body, and a terrifying medieval ritual known as trial by ordeal. Think of it as divine roulette. Spin the suffering, and hope God likes you enough to rig the outcome in your favor. The premise is simple, too simple. They believed that God would protect the innocent from harm. So if you were hurt or died, that was clear proof of guilt. Logical, right? Let's go over your options. First up, ordeal by fire. You're given a red-hot iron bar, often heated until it glows with the fury of 10 furnaces. You carry it for a set number of paces, maybe 3. Then your hand is wrapped in bandages for 3 days. After that, someone inspects the wound. If it's healing, you're innocent. If it's infected, which it almost always is, you're guilty and usually already on your way to a grave or a gibbet. Another classic, ordeal by water. You're bound hand and foot, sometimes with a rope tied to a heavy rock, and dropped into a river. If you float, you're guilty, because floating means you're rejecting the holy water. If you sink, congratulations, you're innocent. Also, you're probably dead. The system technically worked because either way, they felt vindicated. Justice wasn't measured in truth. It was measured in whether or not your lungs filled with water or your flesh melted clean off the bone. Then there's ordeal by ingestion, also known as trial by communion. You're given a piece of consecrated bread or cheese. The idea, if you choke, you're guilty, because clearly God wouldn't let an innocent person die from a simple snack. You could be completely innocent, but nervous, dehydrated, terrified, and one wrong swallow means eternal damnation and a very public execution. This wasn't fringe behavior. This was institutional. These ordeals were sanctioned by both church and state. Clergy presided over them. Towns gathered to watch them, and they were terrifyingly effective at maintaining order. Because fear kept people quiet. Fear kept them obedient. You didn't just fear punishment, you feared the process. It wasn't until the 13th century that the church officially outlawed trial by ordeal. But that didn't mean it vanished. Like all bad ideas with roots in tradition, it lingered. In backwater villages and lordly courts, people still clung to the old ways. Because sometimes it's easier to believe that God will intervene than to admit your system is just killing the poor to make the rich feel righteous. So you stand in front of the crowd, the iron is glowing, the priest is murmuring a prayer, the water waits, and everyone is watching, not to see justice, but to see what kind of spectacle your suffering will become. Forget truth, forget facts, forget even the flimsy logic of divine ordeals. In trial by combat, guilt or innocence was decided the old-fashioned way, by violence. You fought, you bled. You either won or died. And that, they believed, was God's judgment. Victory proved virtue. Death confirmed your sin. It was courtroom drama turned gladiatorial. Here's how it worked. You were accused of a crime. Your accuser stepped forward. If the evidence was lacking, or just not flashy enough, either party could demand a fight to settle the matter. Man versus man. Sometimes woman versus woman. Occasionally, a nobleman versus his own servant. It didn't matter who was stronger or more skilled. It was believed that divine justice would guide the victor's blade. That faith somehow floated above bone, muscle, and experience. Convenient, right? The rules were flexible. Weapons varied depending on your status. A knight might have a sword, a shield, even a war horse. A peasant, maybe a wooden cudgel or a sharp stick. Fights could happen in open fields or muddy courtyards. You'd be watched by lords, clergy, and eager townsfolk munching stale bread while waiting for someone's face to collapse. These weren't just battles. They were public events. A chance for everyone to see justice get its hands dirty. And if you couldn't fight, because you were elderly, ill, or very much a 5-foot-tall seamstress accused of theft, you could name a champion, someone to fight in your name. This worked great if you could afford one. If not, well, good luck with your stick. Trial by combat wasn't fast. Sometimes it lasted hours. Fighters swung until exhaustion set in. Others ended quickly, with the skull cracking open like an egg or a throat sliced before anyone could cheer. If you surrendered mid-fight, that was considered a confession. You lost, you were guilty, and execution would usually follow. If you died during the fight, guilty. If you lived but your opponent did too, and they made a better case afterward, still guilty. But here's the twist. Some used this loophole to their advantage. A stronger accuser might intentionally accuse someone weaker, then force trial by combat to rig the outcome. Might made right, and right became irrelevant. For the powerful, it was just another tool, another show of dominance with a legal ribbon wrapped around a blood-soaked club. Trial by combat wasn't about finding truth. It was about controlling the story. The church eventually frowned upon it, of course, but even disapproval didn't erase the fear, because when words failed and prayers fell silent, the blade became the gavel. And in the Middle Ages, that was often the only justice people understood. There's something deeply unsettling about being told that your fate is in God's hands, especially when that statement is made by the same people lighting the torches, tightening the rope, and standing by with a bucket of hot coals. In the Middle Ages, divine judgment wasn't a private matter. It was public, performative, and absolute. If you were accused of a crime, any crime, your guilt or innocence was ultimately said to be determined by God. But here's the problem. God didn't exactly show up to speak for himself, so human hands took over. And those hands were often cruel, eager, and terrifyingly imaginative. Every trial, every punishment, every execution was justified with the same sacred phrase, "Let God decide." But deciding, in this case, meant letting fire, water, combat, or disease do the talking. If you burned but didn't die, guilty. If you bled out quickly, guilty. If your leg turned black from infection, guilty and also probably cursed. Divine judgment wasn't about faith, it was about control, a tool to keep the fearful in line and the powerful unquestioned. The church claimed God would never let an innocent suffer. But history? History begs to differ. You see, God's judgment always seemed suspiciously aligned with political convenience. If a wealthy merchant needed a competitor gone, he'd sponsor a trial by ordeal and claim righteousness. If a local noble wanted to seize a widow's land, he could have her accused of heresy and leave the rest to God's will. People rotted in dungeons, burned at stakes, and confessed under torture. Not because they were guilty, but because someone powerful said, "Let's ask God," and then stacked the deck before the asking even began. And if the outcome felt unfair, that just meant God was punishing you for something else. Maybe an impure thought. Maybe the sins of your ancestors. Maybe you just weren't pious enough. Divine justice was never questioned, because questioning it meant you were next. And so people stayed quiet, they prayed harder, they avoided eye contact, and they learned that in the Middle Ages, the line between church and court was thinner than a strand of a nun's hair. Worst of all, this system stripped away hope. You couldn't appeal to reason or explain your actions. Logic wasn't welcome. You were judged by fear, spectacle, and divine theater. And in that theater, you were never the writer, just the sacrifice. So when the priest said, "Let God decide," what he really meant was, "We've already decided, and God's just the name we use to sleep at night." If you were a woman in the Middle Ages with a sharp tongue, a herbal remedy, or too many cats, congratulations. You were probably already halfway to being called a witch. Witchcraft wasn't just feared, it was criminalized, weaponized, and used to justify some of the most horrifying acts of violence against women in all of recorded history. And the worst part? You didn't even have to do anything to be labeled a witch. You just had to be different. Maybe you were unmarried past 20. Maybe you gave good advice. Maybe your neighbor's cow died and someone remembered that you had once scowled at it. Suddenly, you're not a woman. You're a threat to the moral fabric of society, a bride of Satan, an agent of darkness, and you're about to face justice. Not fair justice, not even cruel but logical justice. We're talking spectral evidence, invented testimony, and public hysteria fueled by religion, fear, and a deep distrust of female autonomy. You might be stripped and searched for a witch's mark, which could be anything from a mole, to a freckle, to a scar from falling off a ladder. Then you'd be tested, dunked in water, pricked with needles, or forced to confess under torture. That last part was basically guaranteed. And once you confessed, which you would eventually, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because now they had proof, and they'd want names. Who did you fly with? Who did you curse? Who danced with you in the forest under the moonlight? You gave them names, real or imagined, just to stop the pain. And the spiral continued. One woman's accusation fed another. Villages turned on themselves. Mothers, daughters, midwives, widows, none were safe. Witch hunts weren't about crime. They were about control. Social cleansing dressed up as morality. A way to explain bad harvests, plagues, stillbirths, and unwashed guilt. The punishment: burning mostly, or hanging, or slow public humiliation until death became a mercy. Sometimes they burned your corpse after execution, just to make sure the devil didn't snatch it back. Men were accused too, but rarely, and never with the same venom. Witchcraft was a gendered weapon. It targeted women who were too loud, too smart, too independent. It punished knowledge, especially of the body and of nature. In a world ruled by fragile egos and divine fear, a woman who knew how to heal was more dangerous than a man who knew how to kill. So if you lived in a medieval village, you learned fast. Stay quiet. Be useful. Smile small. Don't draw attention. Because once someone called you witch, it was never a question. It was a sentence. And your only escape was through fire. Say the wrong thing, and you might not live to say anything else. In the Middle Ages, words could kill you. Literally. Not because of what they did, but because of what they meant to the people who heard them. Say something that questioned the church, that's blasphemy. Mock a priest's sermon, that's heresy. Joke about a saint, that's treason against heaven. The Middle Ages didn't treat language as casual. Words were sacred. And breaking that sanctity was considered a direct threat to God himself. And God, apparently, was very sensitive. Blasphemy laws weren't just about belief, they were about order. The church didn't just guide the soul, it ruled the land. The priest's voice carried more weight than a noble's sword, and the Bible was not up for discussion. The average person couldn't even read it. Latin kept the scriptures sealed away like divine secrets, and any attempt to interpret or question them was immediately met with suspicion. Why are you asking? Why do you want to know more? Who gave you the right? And if you dared speak in frustration, in grief, in anger, God help you. Saying, God has forsaken us during a famine. That's blasphemy. Mumbling, I don't believe this nonsense after a fire burns your home. That's blasphemy. Even thinking the wrong thing could land you in trouble, especially if a neighbor overheard and decided to save your soul by reporting you. The punishment? Not a slap on the wrist. Public whippings. Fines you couldn't pay. Being pilloried in the square while people threw rotting meat at your face. Or worse, tongue removal. That's right, cut it out, problem solved. For repeat offenders or anyone with a reputation for talking too much, the stakes escalated. You could be excommunicated, which wasn't just a religious penalty, it was social exile. No one could speak to you, feed you, help you. You became a walking curse, marked by God, followed by silence. And if the accusation was serious enough, it could become capital punishment. Beheading, burning, stoning. Executed not for action, but for speech, or even the intention to speak. So people learned to shut up. They whispered instead of speaking. They nodded along in sermons, even if they didn't understand a word. They taught their children to stay quiet, polite, invisible. Because one misstep, one overheard sentence, one unlucky remark, and your mouth became your tomb. In medieval Europe, silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. Stealing in the Middle Ages wasn't about a slap on the wrist or a few weeks in a cell. It was about losing something, usually part of your body. The punishment for theft was brutal, public, and meant to be remembered by everyone who saw it. Especially you. Because once your hand was gone, your life didn't just change, it collapsed. Let's be honest. People didn't steal for fun, they stole to survive. A crust of bread, a pair of boots, a hunk of cheese hardened to the density of stone. That might be dinner for your children. But if you were caught, no one cared about your intentions. No one asked why. Mercy was rare, and theft was treated not as desperation but as defiance, a challenge to the hierarchy. You took something. That meant you threatened the whole fragile system built on ownership and obedience, and systems that fragile tend to respond with violence. First offense? You might lose a finger, usually your dominant hand. Good luck farming or feeding yourself now. Second offense? The whole hand goes, cut off in the square by the executioner with a dull blade, because sharpening it costs money and you're not worth the effort. And if you're unlucky enough to be accused a third time, your life is forfeit. You've proven you can't live among the honest, so now you'll feed the crows. But the cruelty didn't end with dismemberment. There were branding irons too. Letters burned into your skin, T for thief. Usually on your forehead or cheek, so everyone knew. You couldn't hide, couldn't run. You carried your crime like a living wound. No one would hire you. No one would help you. You didn't just lose your hand, you lost your future. And what counted as theft? Anything someone richer than you said did. Taking wood from a noble's forest? Theft. Fishing in the Lord's stream? Theft. Keeping a stray chicken that wandered onto your property? Theft. Owning too much of something while being too poor? Suspicious. That might become theft too if your neighbor got jealous enough, and once accused, you were already halfway to punished. Justice wasn't about deterrence. It was about spectacle. Your mutilated hand was a warning. Your blood on the executioner's stone was a reminder. This could happen to anyone. So keep your head down, stay hungry, and never ever reach for what isn't yours. Because if you do, you might not be able to reach for anything ever again. Not all crimes were treated equally, and when it came to murder, the Middle Ages pulled out all the stops. You'd think killing someone would be a simple case. Someone's dead, someone else did it, time for justice, but no. In medieval Europe, murder wasn't just about what you did. It was about who you were when you did it. Because murder might be a capital crime, but class, status, and reputation turned your punishment into something far more theatrical. If you were a noble and killed another noble in a duel or drunken rage, the punishment might be a fine, or maybe just some temporary exile, while the church said a few prayers for everyone involved. Murder was still wrong, technically, but if you had the right name and enough land, it was also understandable, maybe even expected. Nobles solved disagreements with swords, after all, it was practically sport. But if you were a peasant and killed someone, even by accident, that's not just a crime. It's a challenge to the natural order, a direct insult to the delicate balance of divine hierarchy. You weren't just a murderer. You were a rebel with blood on your hands and no title to protect you. Punishment was swift, brutal, and theatrical. For public murder, you could be dragged to the town square, tied to a horse, and dismembered. Limbs pulled in opposite directions until you came apart like a poorly made puppet. For something quieter, like poison, they got creative. You might be boiled alive in oil, tossed in a barrel with knives, or sewn into a sack with rabid dogs and thrown into the river. Because murder wasn't just punished, it was performed. A lesson to everyone watching. Step out of line, and the system will make an example of you. And if the victim was a priest, a nun, or a child, that's when things got extra ornate. Burning at the stake was common, slow, public, painful, or worse, hanging in a gibbet cage, left to rot above the roads, your body swaying in the wind while birds pecked at your bones. For days, weeks, months, a corpse turned into a billboard. But here's the real kicker. Not all murderers were punished. Some walked free. If the local lord had use for you, if you were strong, loyal, or convenient, he might pardon you entirely. Declare it justified. Maybe you killed a tax collector, maybe a rival suitor. Suddenly, it's not murder, it's service, it's loyalty, it's politics dressed up as mercy, and the corpse, buried and forgotten. Justice was flexible when it needed to be, and if you didn't have someone powerful to speak for you, justice had no reason to remember you. So, yes, murder got fancy. It was loud or quiet, ritualized or chaotic. But it always ended with the same thing, a message, a statement, blood on the cobblestones, and silence that echoed longer than any scream. Let's talk about the man behind the axe, the shadow in the square, the one who makes the final cut, the executioner. In medieval society, he wasn't just a figure of fear, he was an institution, a necessary evil, a professional in a world that constantly demanded punishment. You'd think he'd be powerful, revered, but no. Executioners were feared, yes, but also shunned, reviled, and socially radioactive. People needed them, but they didn't want to know them. Executioners often lived on the outskirts of town, physically and socially. Their homes were isolated, their families avoided. Markets refused to serve them. Priests hesitated to offer last rites. Their very presence was seen as unclean, as if death clung to their clothes like the smell of ash. But when punishment day came, suddenly everyone wanted to see him work. The crowd would gather. Children perched on shoulders. Vendors sold meat pies and ale. And the executioner would walk in, hooded or not, tool in hand. Axe, sword, rope, fire. Whatever the job demanded. And it was a job. Executioners were trained. They learned anatomy, blade balance, timing. A clean beheading wasn't guaranteed. 1 stroke was ideal. 2, embarrassing. 3, you'd better start running. If the executioner botched it, the crowd could turn ugly fast. He wasn't just a killer. He was an entertainer, a surgeon, a symbol of authority. And with every swing, he reinforced the message. Crime equals consequence. But it didn't end with death. Executioners also did the dirty follow-ups. They disposed of bodies, cleaned the platforms. Sometimes they flayed corpses or boiled heads for display. They branded criminals, administered torture, and occasionally pulled teeth. Yes, seriously. In towns without barbers or blacksmiths willing to touch the damned, the executioner became the fallback man. Need a tooth pulled? A boil lanced? A confession extracted? He was your guy. This created a strange paradox. The man you feared most might also be the one who reset your dislocated shoulder. The one who dismembered your cousin last week might be the one who cures your fever with leeches next Tuesday. People whispered about them. avoided eye contact. But when pain came knocking and no one else answered, the executioner opened the door. It was a life of isolation, fear, and necessity. Executioners passed down their trade from father to son because no one else wanted it. No other family would dare take it up. But without them, the entire system fell apart. Punishment loses its teeth without someone willing to swing the blade. So, yes, the executioner had a side hustle. He was the butcher of the body and the glue of a legal system held together by fear. His axe didn't just end lives, it maintained order, one swing at a time. When the crime was treason, the punishment didn't just aim to kill, it aimed to erase your very existence from memory through horror, spectacle, and humiliation so extreme it echoed across generations. Welcome to the grim masterpiece of medieval justice, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. A sentence so brutal, so methodically grotesque, that even its name arrives in stages. It wasn't one punishment, it was a collection. A slow, ceremonial demolition of the human body designed to send one message: defy the crown. And this is what you become. The process began with hanging, but not the clean snap of the neck most associate with execution. This was a short drop hang. You didn't die, you dangled, choking, twisting, as your body spasmed against the noose. It was meant to weaken you, not kill you. They wanted your heart beating for what came next. Then came the drawing. Not artistic. This wasn't a portrait, it was a dragging. You were tied to a horse and pulled across filthy roads, your half-conscious body grinding through dirt, stones, dung, and whatever refuse the town decided to toss. Sometimes this happened before the hanging, sometimes after. But either way, it made sure you arrived at the next stage broken, bruised, and barely breathing. Finally, the quartering. You were stripped, tied down, and eviscerated. Literally, your abdomen sliced open, your intestines pulled out slowly, sometimes while you were still alive. Your genitals, if you were male, often removed and burned before your eyes. Your body was then cut into 4 parts: arms, legs, whatever could be made into a warning. Your head was severed and placed on a pike, usually on the city gates. The rest of you? Scattered to the corners of the kingdom. It wasn't just violence, it was theater. A morality play drenched in blood. Crowds gathered for this. Families brought children. Vendors sold beer. People cheered. They weren't just watching a death. They were watching the empire assert itself through flesh. To betray the king was to tear at the fabric of the realm, so your body had to be torn in return. And here's the truly twisted part. This wasn't the exception. This was law, codified, approved by church and crown. A sentence carried out not in secret but with trumpets, announcements, and fanfare. Your death wasn't just a punishment, it was propaganda. A warning carved into bone and stretched across the map. And for those watching, it worked. Because after witnessing a man reduced to meat in the name of justice, silence suddenly felt patriotic. It was more than a punishment. It was entertainment. A public hanging in the Middle Ages wasn't just about removing a criminal from society. It was about reinforcing authority, providing spectacle, and reminding the masses where they stood. In a time without television, justice was live and in person. And hanging day, that was showtime. The gallows were usually built in the town square, the market crossroads, or the highest hill. Anywhere with a clear view. Notices went up days in advance. People prepared like it was a holiday. Merchants stocked up on pies, beer, and trinkets. Families arrived early to get good spots. Children perched on shoulders. Gossip flowed like wine. And when the condemned was finally marched in, bound and grim-faced, the energy turned electric. Some wept, some begged, some walked in silence, already dead inside. Others preached, cursed, or sang, but all were met with the same setup. A wooden platform, a rope, and a crowd hungry for closure or spectacle. The priest murmured final prayers, the executioner adjusted the noose, and then the trapdoor opened, or the ladder was kicked, or the cart pulled away, and the body dropped. If it was a long drop, the neck snapped, quick, clean, efficient. But more often, it was a short drop or no drop, leaving the condemned to choke and thrash while the crowd watched their death in real time. Faces turned purple, feet kicked in the air. Some took minutes to die, others longer, and the audience loved it. Not out of pure cruelty, though there was plenty of that, but because it made justice real, tangible. They could point at it, talk about it, warn their children with it. The corpse often hung for hours or days. Crows picked at the eyes. Rain soaked the rags. People passed by and crossed themselves. "That's what happens," they'd mutter, and everyone nodded. Because even if they didn't believe the accused was truly guilty, no one dared say it out loud. You didn't question justice. You just watched it happen. Sometimes multiple people were hanged at once, row after row of twitching bodies swinging in unison. Other times, one hanging followed another in intervals, like the world's darkest parade. And if you were lucky enough to get a last word, the town would remember it, especially if you repented. Confession made for better drama. It made the whole thing feel justified. Public hanging wasn't about death. It was about fear. It was about making an example, and it worked. Because once you've seen a man kick the air for 8 minutes straight, the law starts to feel less like an idea and more like an executioner's hand around your throat. If you were sentenced to death in the Middle Ages and had the right bloodline, the right family name, or the right friends in high places, your execution came with a touch of elegance. It was still fatal. Don't get that twisted, but it was cleaner, faster, and far less humiliating than what the common folk endured. It was the VIP suite of capital punishment: beheading. Beheading was reserved for nobility, kings, queens, lords, knights, people whose lives had once been steeped in privilege, and even in death that privilege continued. You weren't dragged through the mud or hung like meat in the square. No, you were led to the execution block with a priest nearby, a well-oiled blade waiting, and sometimes even a velvet cushion to kneel on. The symbolism was everything. Beheading said this person mattered, even as they died. But make no mistake, it wasn't always smooth. While the ideal was a swift single strike, the reality often went wrong. An inexperienced executioner, a dull blade, or just bad luck could turn a noble's dignified exit into a drawn-out horror show. There are countless stories of necks being hacked repeatedly, 2, 3, even 4 times, before the head finally separated. Scream, swing, miss again. By the 4th strike, the crowd wasn't clapping. They were vomiting. Still, beheading remained the most honorable way to go. You could even request a sword instead of an axe if your status allowed it. The sword was considered more precise, more respectable, more continental, as the French might say. England preferred axes, though. Heavy, brutal, direct, the kind of tool you could use on a traitor or a tree. And then there were the famous executions, the ones that became legend. Anne Boleyn, Sir Thomas More, Mary Queen of Scots. Each one transformed into a cautionary tale, a whispered lesson on what happens when power slips or ambition climbs too high. Sometimes the condemned delivered a final speech. Sometimes they forgave their executioner. Sometimes they paid him extra gold for a quick, merciful cut. That's right, tips for efficiency. Because even when your head's on the line, class still matters. Afterward, the head was often displayed. Not on a pike, like a common criminal, but in a basket, covered respectfully. Or, if you were unlucky, paraded briefly to the crowd as proof the deed was done. The body was buried, the name was recorded, and the message was clear. No one, not even the powerful, was untouchable. But compared to what happened to peasants, witches, and rebels, beheading was practically a gift, a gruesome ceremonial goodbye wrapped in velvet and sealed with steel. If you had to die in the Middle Ages, this was the closest thing to mercy. Now, we come to one of the most infamous punishments of the medieval world, death by fire. No trial was more feared, no sentence more final, and no execution more drenched in symbolism. To be burned alive wasn't just about death, it was about purification, public redemption through agony. Your body became a warning, your screams a sermon, and your ashes a dark kind of absolution. Burning was often reserved for crimes that society found spiritually threatening. Heresy, witchcraft, sodomy, blasphemy, anything that went beyond simple disobedience and into the realm of moral panic. This wasn't punishment for what you did. It was punishment for what you represented. You weren't just guilty. You were unclean. Fire, they believed, didn't just destroy the body, it cleansed the soul. The ritual varied, but the outcome didn't. You were tied to a stake, sometimes upright, sometimes horizontal, then surrounded by fuel, wood, straw, pitch. The crowd gathered. The executioner lit the fire, and that was that. You didn't die quickly. The heat rose, the smoke choked, the skin blistered, the fat popped. It was a performance, and it didn't end until the crowd had seen enough. In some cases, they showed a flicker of mercy, strangling you first before lighting the pyre. But that mercy was rare and often denied if you were unrepentant. Why show kindness to a witch? To a heretic? To someone who spoke against God or cured a child with herbs instead of prayer? You burned. And the flames danced. For the audience, this was more than punishment. It was justice turned into spectacle. A sacred bonfire. Parents brought their children to watch. Clergy gave final blessings. Choirs sometimes sang. The smell filled the air, hair, flesh, bone. It lingered for hours, sometimes days. And afterward, the ashes were scattered or thrown into rivers. No burial, no gravestone, no memory. The most famous burnings? Always women. Joan of Arc. Countless unnamed midwives, healers, and widows. But men weren't immune. The Inquisition alone sent thousands to the flames. And across Europe, stakes were built with horrifying regularity. Each fire a bright orange line drawn around acceptable thought. Burning alive wasn't just about death. It was about erasure, turning a person into smoke, into silence, into something people whispered about then forgot. The ultimate warning that belief, knowledge, or defiance could ignite more than ideas. It could ignite you. Not every punishment in the Middle Ages ended in blood. Some ended in shame. But don't mistake that for mercy. Because in a society obsessed with public order, humiliation wasn't just a tool, it was an art form. Enter the stocks and the pillory, two of the most infamous devices in medieval punishment. They didn't kill you, they broke you, socially, spiritually, and sometimes physically. And they did it in full view of everyone you've ever known. Let's start with the stocks. A horizontal wooden frame, usually planted in the center of town, where your ankles were locked between two thick planks. You couldn't walk, couldn't run, could barely move. You just sat there for hours, sometimes days, and the longer you sat, the worse it got. Rain, sunburn, freezing wind, you took it all. Birds pooped on you, insects crawled over you, children laughed at you. And adults, they threw things. Rotten vegetables if they were in a good mood, stones if they weren't. The goal wasn't to hurt you fatally. It was to expose you, turn you into a cautionary tale in real time. Then there was the pillory, the stock's cruel older sibling. Instead of just your feet, this device clamped your neck and wrists upright, forcing you to stand, strain, and be seen. Your spine ached, your arms went numb, your legs shook, and still you were visible. Everyone in town passed you, some sneered, some spit. Others just stared, long, judging, endless stares that said, "You deserve this." And if you collapsed, too bad. There was no escape until the sentence ended, or your body did. Why were people placed here for lying, for gossip, for cheating, stealing, being drunk in public, owing too much debt, or saying something unpopular about the wrong person? It didn't take much. And once you were in the pillory, your crime didn't matter. You were just a criminal. That label burned brighter than any brand. And when your time was up, you didn't go home triumphant. You shuffled away with bruises, cuts, and dignity reduced to dust. Employers wouldn't touch you. Neighbors stopped talking to you. Children mocked you for weeks. The stocks didn't just punish, they branded your soul. They left a permanent smudge on your place in the village. Because in medieval justice, pain was just one path. Public disgrace was another, and sometimes it lasted longer. Sometimes the punishment didn't end when they let you go. Sometimes they made sure it followed you for the rest of your life. That's what the branding iron was for. It didn't kill, it didn't imprison, it marked you, permanently, turned your body into a criminal record that you could never outrun, no matter where you fled or how much you changed. Branding wasn't reserved for the most heinous crimes. It was used broadly. Theft, fraud, adultery, vagrancy, desertion, blasphemy, even inciting unrest, whatever that meant at the time. The idea was simple. Take a red-hot iron, shaped into a letter or symbol, and press it into flesh. Usually the hand, the shoulder, or the face. Especially the face. Because why whisper someone's crime when you can make it shout from their skin? T for thief, F for forger, V for vagrant. In France, heretics got a fleur de lis. Branded once, you were tainted. Branded twice, you were irredeemable. Some people were branded as a first strike, a warning. Step out of line again, and next time would be the noose. The process was ritualistic. You were dragged into the square, usually tied to a post or forced to kneel. The crowd gathered. The iron glowed in the fire until it pulsed like the sun. And then it was pressed into your skin with a sound that would haunt you. Hiss, scream, silence. The pain was brief but searing. The damage, lifelong. And it wasn't just the physical scar. It was the aftermath. Branded individuals couldn't work, couldn't marry, couldn't even walk down the road without someone crossing to the other side. You were treated like a disease. Visible, feared, shunned. People whispered. Children pointed. Guards watched you like a wolf on a leash. Some tried to cover it. Grew out beards, wore hoods, wrapped hands in cloth. But in towns where everyone knew everyone, the brand burned through every disguise. It wasn't just on your flesh, it was in your story, stamped onto your soul. Because branding wasn't just about punishment, it was about ownership. You didn't just commit a crime, you became it. Branded, labeled, and forever reduced to a single, seared symbol. In the Middle Ages, being a woman with a voice, literally, could be dangerous. Society had little patience for female defiance, and even less for female speech. Women who gossiped, argued, interrupted, or simply spoke too much were labeled scolds. a word that sounded petty but carried deadly serious consequences. Because in a world ruled by silence and submission, the punishment for being loud was iron strapped to your face. It was called the scold's bridle, or the brank, a metal cage designed not to protect you, but to trap you. It clamped over the head like a vice, with a long, flat plate that slid into your mouth and pressed against the tongue. Some versions had sharp edges or spikes. Every movement, every syllable, every attempt to speak meant blood. The pain wasn't just physical. It was humiliating, psychological, degrading. You weren't just silenced, you were made into a spectacle. They'd march you through the village like that. Chained, head clamped, gag in place, while crowds followed and laughed and pointed. Some were forced to wear bells on the bridle so people could hear them coming. The metallic chime of shame. It didn't matter what you'd said. Criticizing your husband, complaining about taxes, warning a neighbor about bad grain. The crime was speech. The justice was enforced silence, and it wasn't a private punishment. The scold's bridle was designed for display. You were transformed into a walking warning. Other women were meant to see you, to absorb the message. This is what happens when you speak out of turn. Keep your opinions to yourself. Keep your questions quiet. Keep your voice low, or lose it altogether. And if you cried, choked, or begged, that just made the crowd lean in closer. Because humiliation was part of the sentence. Your tears were proof the system worked. And when the bridle finally came off, if it did, your tongue might still work, but your spirit didn't. You learned to stay silent, to keep secrets, to whisper in corners. Because words could get you gagged, chained, and paraded like livestock. The scold's bridle wasn't about justice. It was about control. About making sure the powerless stayed powerless, and that women in particular never forgot their place. It was metal forged in silence and polished by fear, and for hundreds of years it did its job flawlessly. If the scold's bridle silenced women, the ducking stool drowned them. Designed primarily for disorderly women, a phrase that could mean anything from gossiping to arguing to simply existing with too much spirit. The ducking stool was the Middle Ages' solution to behavior they didn't want to deal with. It was a chair, a simple wooden seat mounted on a long beam like a giant seesaw, and it was used to plunge people into cold, filthy, soul-wrenching water. The accused was tied to the chair and paraded through town, wheeled on a cart or dragged behind horses, while the townspeople jeered. This was not just punishment. It was a mobile display of social correction. Once they reached the local pond or river, the chair was swung out over the water, then dropped. Splash. You went under, tied, helpless, submerged in muck. Then up, gasp, shiver, down again, upper, down again. It continued until your resolve or your breath ran out. Sometimes it was one dunk, sometimes dozens. The record? Unknown, but many never made it out. Cold water, shock, panic, and weight made sure of that. There was no compassion here. If you protested or fought back, the crowd grew louder. If you confessed or cried, the men holding the ropes called it repentance and cheered their own success. It wasn't just for scolds. Alleged witches, suspected adulterers, and women who stood too tall or argued too fiercely all found themselves bound to that dripping seat. And in many places the ducking itself was part of the trial. Survive without confessing? Guilt? Confess under duress? Still guilty. Either way, you're soaked, broken, and no longer a threat. Men were ducked too, occasionally, for things like cheating or spreading rumors, but overwhelmingly it was women who bore the brunt. Because the ducking stool wasn't about water. It was about warning, a signal to every wife, daughter, and sister. Behave. Stay small. Stay silent. Or the next splash might be yours. And when the ordeal was over, if you survived, you didn't dry off and start fresh. You dripped home through muddy roads, clothes clinging to your skin, lungs aching, legs shaking, ears still ringing from the laughter of your neighbors. And you never forgot the feeling of sinking, not into water, but into helplessness. There are many ways to die in the Middle Ages, quickly, publicly, painfully, but some deaths were slower, more deliberate, more visible. That's where the iron cage came in. Less of a punishment and more of a statement. The iron cage wasn't designed to correct your behavior. It was designed to display your decay, day by day, bone by bone, until there was nothing left but rust and memory. Picture this: a human-sized metal frame, shaped like a coffin or shaped like you. Some were simple, a barred box hanging from a tree or scaffold. Others were elaborate, molded to the body like steel armor with no padding, no mercy. You were locked inside, no room to move, no space to sit. Limbs stretched, back curved, neck bent until pain became permanence. Then they hung you up, high above the road in the square by the church, someplace where everyone would see. That was the point. You didn't go to the cage in secret. You became the cage. A human warning sign swaying in the wind, clanking softly while birds circled. You might already be dead when they locked you in, but often you weren't. You were alive, gasping, bleeding, starving, forgotten. And there were no guards, no meals, no prayers. You were exposed to the elements: rain, snow, sun, heat. Flies feasted on your wounds. Crows pecked at your fingers. Rats waited below for whatever dropped. It could take days. It could take weeks. You didn't scream after the first day. Your voice was gone. What remained was a silhouette of suffering, a figure trapped in stillness while the world moved on without you. The crime? Maybe it was murder, maybe banditry, or maybe just the wrong words said in the wrong place to the wrong person. The cage wasn't used often. It was special. A final act of cruelty reserved for the crimes that most offended those in power. You weren't just killed. You were displayed, exhibited, preserved. Even after death, they left you hanging. Your body shriveled, your bones hardened. The wind rocked you gently, like a grotesque wind chime. Generations of villagers passed your remains and whispered your name with a mix of fear and relief. That was him, they'd say. That's what happens. And for children walking home at dusk, the iron cage became a story, a bedtime horror, visible against the sky. Because in the Middle Ages, death wasn't enough. You had to die loudly, visibly, slowly, so that every breath you lost kept someone else obedient. In a society without mass media, punishment had to be seen to be believed. And in the Middle Ages, nothing was more effective than turning the accused into a walking billboard of failure. Public humiliation wasn't just a side effect of justice. It was part of the design. A policy, a tool, a carefully calculated psychological weapon. The logic was simple. Fear prevents crime, and nothing provokes fear like being stripped of your dignity in front of the people you eat, trade, worship, and sleep beside. This wasn't anonymous disgrace. It was intimate degradation. Punishments were crafted not just to hurt the body, but to tear open the soul and let the crowd watch it bleed. Stocks, pillories, whippings in the square, forced parades, naked marches, shaving heads, dressing men in women's clothing or hanging signs around their necks with the word liar, thief, or traitor scrawled in soot. You weren't hidden from the community. You were forced into its center, made to stand as a reflection of what not to be. And the crowd wasn't passive. They were participants, encouraged to mock, to laugh, to throw. They brought rotten eggs, muck, stones, words sharper than any blade. Public humiliation turned neighbors into punishers, and once you wore the shame, it stuck like dried blood. You could survive the punishment and still die from the aftermath. No one hired the man who cried while whipped. No one married the woman marched through town in rags. No one forgot what they saw, especially if it was entertaining. The punishments weren't equal either. The poor were humiliated constantly. The rich, rarely. Nobles might be fined, exiled, or quietly executed behind stone walls. But the average man? He was a stage show, a lesson, an example. Whether it was for stealing bread, owing a debt, or kissing the wrong person in the wrong alley, punishment was about visibility. Some towns even held shame days, local festivals of correction where multiple sentences were carried out for community bonding. It wasn't justice, it was spectacle. Crime and punishment turned into ritual, a circus of suffering made holy through repetition. And for the ones who endured it, there was no return to normal. You lived in the shadow of what they made you wear, say, or do. Because in the Middle Ages, humiliation didn't end when the crowd went home. It echoed every time someone looked away from you in the street. You might think prison is the lesser punishment. A pause. A waiting room between accusation and execution. But in the Middle Ages, prison wasn't a sentence. It was a death sentence in disguise. You didn't go to jail to be rehabilitated. You went to jail to rot. Slowly, quietly, forgotten by the world, chewed alive by time, filth, and despair. Medieval prisons were hellholes, sometimes literal. Carved into cliffs, built beneath castles, wedged under monasteries where piety didn't quite reach the basement. These weren't clean corridors with individual cells. They were damp stone pits. One entrance, no exits. The walls wept with moisture. The ceilings hung low with mold. And the air? The air was thick with breath, decay, and the soft shuffle of things with too many legs. There were no beds, no blankets, just straw, if you were lucky, and that straw was already a home to lice, fleas, and disease. You slept beside rats and corpses. You ate, if food came at all, what guards scraped off their own plates. No salt, no sanitation. A bowl of boiled weeds and water thick enough to chew. Starvation wasn't a tactic. It was routine. And the guards, they weren't there to protect you. They were barely more than jailers for hire. Bribery was common, so was cruelty. Some beat the prisoners just to break up the boredom. Others didn't bother speaking at all. Just slammed the door and let the screams fade. Disease was everywhere. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. No one was treated. No one was isolated. The sick lay beside the slightly less sick until both became corpses. Sometimes, prisoners chained to a wall would spend their last days beside a rotting neighbor, flies buzzing, the stench so thick it burned. The only escape was death, or madness. Some prisons didn't have guards, they just sealed the room and waited. No visits, no verdict, just silence and darkness. You were sentenced not to time, but to neglect. Your body would tell the story. Bones picked clean by vermin. Eyes lost in the dark. A voice reduced to coughs and whispers. If anyone found your corpse, it was buried in a pit with the rest. No name, no cross. In the Middle Ages, the punishment wasn't just being locked away. It was being erased, piece by piece, from memory. Your body remained. Your spirit didn't. If the filth didn't kill you in prison, the disease surely would. Behind those stone walls, plague and pestilence didn't just visit. They moved in, unpacked their bags, and made themselves at home. Medieval jails were perfect breeding grounds for sickness. No sunlight, no airflow, no separation between the healthy and the dying. Your cough was your new identity. Your fever was your future. One sneeze, one sore, one boil, that's all it took. And in a crowded cell where 10 people shared 5 square feet, illness didn't spread, it exploded. The Black Death didn't skip the prisons. In fact, it adored them. Tight quarters, dead bodies, piss-soaked straw, no clean water, no medicine. It was a party for bacteria and rats, and you were the feast. You didn't get treatment, you got superstition. A bleeding, maybe, if you were rich. A cold compress and a prayer if you weren't. But mostly nothing. Because no one wanted to touch you. Not the jailers, not the monks, not even your fellow prisoners who crawled to the opposite wall and watched you die through fever-glazed eyes. Symptoms came fast. Boils the size of eggs. Pus that stank like death. Blood from your mouth, your nose, your ears. Delirium followed, screaming, moaning. Pleas for mercy that echoed endlessly off stone walls. Some clawed at their own skin. Some tore their hair out. Others just lay down, eyes wide, unmoving, waiting for breath to stop. The dead weren't removed daily, sometimes not at all. Bodies piled beside the living, bloating in the heat, attracting clouds of flies so thick they darkened torchlight. The smell turned stomachs. The sound of breathing became a horror. Because every cough might be the one that ended you. And if you didn't die of plague, there was still scurvy from the lack of anything fresh, gangrene from untreated wounds, or tuberculosis, which sat in your lungs like a hidden time bomb. You became a walking disease. Bones trembling, eyes sunken, skin patchy with rot. No doctor, no cure, just time, infection, and decay. In medieval prisons, death wasn't dramatic. It was slow, soft, and contagious. One man's wheeze became another man's grave, and by the end, no one remembered your name. Just the cough that wouldn't stop, and the empty space you left behind on the straw-covered floor. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as being too young to know better. Childhood, as we understand it today, barely existed. You were a child only until you could walk, lift, obey. And once you could steal, you could be punished. Child criminals weren't protected. They were prosecuted, judged, whipped, imprisoned, hanged. It didn't take much. A boy caught with a turnip tucked under his tunic. A girl caught picking herbs near the castle wall. Theft, trespassing, begging without permission. Those were crimes no matter how small the hands that committed them. The same laws that condemned adult men were applied to children. The same punishments, scaled down only slightly, if at all. And if you think the community stepped in to protect them, think again. Villages watched it happen. Parents wept. But justice was considered sacred, and discipline divine. Many believed that harsh punishment could save the soul. So when a child was marched through the square, tied to a post for a whipping, the crowd nodded in grim approval. Better now than later. Better bruises than hell. Some were thrown into prisons with adults, shivering between murderers and thieves, their voices too soft to echo off the stone. Others were branded, marked for life before they'd learned to spell their own names. A few were even sentenced to death. By hanging, by drowning, by burning. The crimes? Stealing clothes, setting a fire, speaking out of turn in church. And yet, the system claimed to be merciful. A young offender might be given a lesser punishment, like mutilation instead of death. Lose a finger, or an ear, or be forced to walk through town with a sign reading, "Thief," while other children laughed and threw stones. Because in a world built on fear and control, making an example of the young wasn't cruelty. It was policy. There were no juvenile courts, no reform homes, no second chances. Once labeled a criminal, a child grew into that label, became it, lived under its weight, carried it into adulthood, if they lived that long. Because in medieval justice, guilt had no age limit. And mercy? That was reserved for the powerful. So when a child stood before the judge, shaking, barefoot, clutching the remains of a stolen apple, there was no comfort, only judgment, and the knowledge that in the eyes of the law they were already one step into the grave. Poverty wasn't just a hardship in the Middle Ages, it was a liability. To be poor wasn't simply to lack resources, it was to be suspect, dangerous, a problem that needed to be controlled. In a society where order was everything, the poor were constantly watched, judged, and punished. Not for what they did, but for what they might do. Because if you had nothing, it was assumed you'd eventually steal something. And preemptive punishment? That was fair game. There were no social safety nets, no welfare, no one to feed you when crops failed or illness struck. If you couldn't work because of injury, age, or simple misfortune, you begged. And begging? That was illegal unless you had a license from the local lord or church. Imagine that, a permit to starve publicly. Without it, you were a vagrant, a criminal, a target, sleep in the wrong field, trespassing, hunt a rabbit to feed your children, poaching, pick up firewood in the forest, theft, be in the wrong village without reason, that's loitering. And loitering, in the medieval mindset, was the first step to rebellion. So you were fined, beaten, branded, jailed, or simply told to move along, until you collapsed in a ditch no one would claim. Women suffered doubly. A widow without support could be accused of witchcraft for surviving too long. An unmarried woman too poor to buy clean clothes was suspect just by existing. Children born into poverty were blamed for the sins of their parents. Whole families marked as trouble before they could even stand. And yet the poor were essential. They worked the land, built the roads, served the lords. Their labor kept the system running, but their presence inconvenient, embarrassing. So the punishment of poverty became a kind of maintenance. Keep them low, keep them scared, keep them from asking why. Even charity had strings. Alms were only given to the deserving poor, a vague term decided by the wealthy. If you looked too strong, too proud, too different, you were deemed undeserving. And if you asked again, that made you dangerous. And dangerous people needed to be punished. Poverty wasn't a condition. It was a crime. One you couldn't escape. Because even if you never stole, never lied, never fought, you were still guilty of being visible, of being hungry, of needing more than the world was willing to give. In the Middle Ages, justice wasn't blind. It had perfect vision, especially when it came to coin, titles, and land. The wealthy didn't just live better, they died better, or more often didn't die at all, because if you were rich, punishment was optional, negotiable, a matter of reputation management. The same crime that sent a peasant to the noose might get a noble a fine or a gentle slap on the velvet-gloved wrist. Murder? That could be settled with a blood price. Theft? Pay it back, plus a generous donation to the church. Adultery? Well, boys will be boys, and if you were caught red-handed, the court might still rule in your favor if the other party was of lower station. After all, you couldn't let a poor man's testimony outweigh a rich man's honor. Trials were stacked. The rich could afford scribes, scholars, advocates, early forms of lawyers, trained in how to twist words like knots. They could stall proceedings, appeal to higher courts, buy clerical indulgences or spiritual immunity from the church. For nobles, being sentenced to death took work. You had to really push the envelope. Treason, heresy, political failure. And even then, you might get beheaded privately in a clean room, while a monk wept for your soul. Contrast that with the poor. No representation, no resources, no time. Trials were swift and brutal. Testimonies were one-sided. You stood alone, shaking, while your lord or accuser reclined on a bench carved with angels. The outcome was known before the gavel fell, because it had been whispered in coin long before your name was even called. Even punishments meant to be equal weren't. A rich man might be imprisoned in a guarded manner or allowed house arrest in his estate. A poor man would be thrown into a pit to rot. Nobles could request execution by sword, quick, clean, dignified. Peasants got ropes, fire, and crowds eager for a show. The law existed, technically, for all, but its enforcement was shaped like a ladder. The higher you stood, the less you bled. The lower you fell, the more likely you were to become the warning others learned from. And so, justice in the Middle Ages didn't fail the poor. It simply wasn't for them. In a medieval courtroom, truth didn't echo loudly, but gold did. Bribes weren't shameful. They were standard operating procedure. A quiet nod, a heavy pouch, a favor traded in candlelight. That's what moved the gears of justice. Laws were written in parchment, but judgments were carved in coin. Everything had a price. From arrest to verdict, every step could be greased with silver. Want a guard to forget a theft report? A few florins. Want the scribe to lose your confession? Add a little more. Want the judge to consider your innocence or just look the other way while you leave town? Well, that depends on how heavy your purse is and how much wine he's already had. Justice wasn't administered, it was negotiated, and the poor had nothing to negotiate with. But the rich weren't the only ones who played the game. Favors worked too. The blacksmith who shoed the sheriff's horse might get a warning instead of a whipping. The baker who kept the priest fed might get her son's name removed from the punishment roll. Barter, service, loyalty, it all counted. But only if the right person valued you. And this was dangerous because it turned law into a popularity contest. Not about guilt or innocence, but about connections. The widow who fed orphans but crossed a noble, burned as a witch. The drunk who brawled every week but polished the constable's boots, sent home with a nod. Justice became slippery, shapeless, less a scale and more a seesaw rigged from one end. The church played along. A priest could absolve sins for a price, or offer letters of forgiveness to criminals with enough gold to fund a new bell tower. Sin, like justice, became transactional, a market of guilt and redemption. And so the people learned that silence could be bought, that laws could be bent, that punishment could be dodged, not by goodness but by influence. And the cruelest part? Everyone pretended otherwise, that the law was fair, that God watched all. That punishment was earned, even as the judge tucked your bribe into his robe. In the Middle Ages, justice didn't just wear a blindfold. It wore a purse string, tight, heavy, and always open. In the Middle Ages, getting arrested didn't mean you were on your way to a swift trial. Far from it. Justice moved slowly, if it moved at all. You might think a delay was a chance for mercy, a pause, a breath, a sliver of hope. But in reality, a delayed trial wasn't a break. It was a sentence in disguise. Because every day you waited was another day spent in the worst place imaginable, a medieval prison. The reasons for delay were endless. Maybe the judge was away. Maybe a local noble was reconsidering the charges. Maybe there weren't enough witnesses. Or maybe the court was just waiting for the plague to pass, or the priest to finish his pilgrimage. You were told nothing. You were simply left to wait. And that wait could be weeks, months, even years. No sun, no fresh food, no idea when or if you'd ever see daylight again. You weren't innocent until proven guilty. You were guilty by stagnation, a body in a cage, a name on a list, forgotten, until someone important remembered they were supposed to judge you. And sometimes that delay was intentional. A slow death was easier to stomach than a messy trial. Let the prisoner rot, let the fever do the work. No executioner required. Just time, mold, and the occasional rat. The court could then announce he died before judgment, and move on, guilt-free. Delays were often used strategically. A powerful man might delay a trial until a witness left town, or until the accused died, or until public interest faded and they could sweep the mess under a decorative rug. And for those without power, delay meant suffering without resolution. Suspended animation in a world already too cruel to care. Worse still, you were expected to pay for your own confinement. Food, if it came, cost money. Water, extra, clean straw, a luxury. If your family couldn't bribe the guards or bring scraps from home, you starved. And still your trial sat, untouched, beneath a dusty stack of scrolls on someone's desk. And if you were lucky enough to live until your court date, good luck defending yourself after 2 years of starvation and sickness. Your mind was broken. Your body barely stood. And the court looked at you like the delay had been a favor. In medieval justice, time didn't heal. It didn't clarify. It didn't forgive. It just waited. Until you were too weak to matter. If secular justice in the Middle Ages was cruel, religious justice was something else entirely. Ruthless, divine, and unquestionable. Because when the church judged you, it didn't just look at your actions. It examined your soul. And if the priest decided your soul was dirty, then no earthly suffering would be too great to cleanse it. Religious courts, operated by bishops, monks, and inquisitors, oversaw anything deemed a spiritual offense. Heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, sorcery, adultery, questioning church doctrine, even reading the wrong book. You didn't have to break the law, you just had to doubt out loud, speak with the wrong tone, own the wrong object, dream the wrong dream. The church didn't need proof. It needed belief, and once it believed you were guilty, you were already lost. You weren't tried by your peers. You were tried by men who saw themselves as agents of God. And God, they claimed, wanted answers. So you were interrogated, tortured, humiliated, told to confess not just what you did, but what you thought, what you believed, what you feared. And if you didn't, that was more evidence you were guilty. The Inquisition took this to its most terrifying extreme. Entire rooms filled with tools of pain and salvation. Iron chairs, fire, racks, masks, hooks. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to save your soul through agony. Confession was expected. Torture was authorized. And if you survived long enough to admit your sins, they thanked you for it, right before setting you on fire. Penalties were severe: public penance, branding, exile, whippings, death by slow flame. Even those spared execution were ruined, financially, socially, spiritually. Their lands confiscated, their names blackened, their neighbors warned, and their families left behind to carry the shame. And here's the true horror. These courts believed they were helping you. They told you to be grateful, that suffering purified, that pain would lead to paradise. They didn't call it cruelty. They called it mercy. You couldn't appeal. You couldn't argue. The very act of defending yourself was seen as prideful, and pride was a sin. Silence was suspicious. Logic was dangerous. And tears? just further proof that the devil was fleeing your body inch by inch. In religious courts, justice wasn't measured in fairness or fact. It was measured in submission. And the moment you were accused, you became a canvas for their holy correction. In the Middle Ages, executions weren't quiet affairs carried out behind stone walls. They were public events, loud, bloody, theatrical. The community showed up, and not out of horror but out of habit, because punishment wasn't just about ending a life. It was about entertaining the crowd while doing it. Death was a message, and the crowd was the audience that needed to hear it. Days before, announcements were made. People cleared their schedules. Markets expanded their stalls. Bakers made extra loaves. Ale flowed freely. Parents brought their children. Not despite the violence, but because of it. "You need to see this," they'd say. "This is how we stay safe." The condemned were paraded through town. Shackled, bruised, bleeding. If they were lucky, they rode. If not, they walked barefoot, dragged through streets lined with spit, curses, and rotten vegetables. Behind them marched clergy, chanting prayers, as if to say, "This is holy, this is just." At the execution site, whether it was a scaffold, a gallows, a fire pit, crowds gathered in the hundreds, sometimes thousands. Vendors sold snacks. Jugglers entertained between floggings. It was a festival of fear. And the main act? A man or woman standing alone before death, while the crowd jeered and judged. They watched with fascination. Would the axe fall clean? Would the fire catch fast? Would the condemned beg, scream, remain silent? Every gesture became drama. Every gasp part of the performance. And when it was over, when the neck cracked or the flames roared, the crowd didn't turn away. They cheered. Not because they were monsters, but because the system taught them to believe this was necessary. Executions reminded people of their place. That law ruled above mercy. That stepping out of line led not just to death, but to humiliation before everyone you knew. And they internalized it. Children learned it early. Adults learned it deeper. Obedience was survival. Silence was smart. Pain belonged to those who misbehaved. Even the executioner became a local celebrity, respected and feared, a man with power in his hands and blood on his boots. His swing could determine the mercy of a moment. He wasn't just ending a life. He was enforcing the story. Because in the Middle Ages, justice didn't whisper, it shouted, and executions were its loudest sermons. In modern times, death ends with dignity, a burial, a tomb, a place to grieve. But in the Middle Ages, you didn't always get that luxury. If you died as a criminal, especially one executed for treason, heresy, or anything that insulted the powerful, your body didn't belong to your family. It belonged to the state. And what happened next wasn't about closure, it was about control. Your corpse became a tool, a warning, a prop in the ongoing performance of punishment. Sometimes your head was mounted on a spike, blackened with tar and displayed above the city gates, your mouth open in a silent scream, your eyes long gone. Sometimes your body was left hanging from the gallows for weeks, skin tightening, limbs stiffening, animals feeding on your decay. Passers-by would point and nod. "That's what happens," they'd say. "Remember that." If you were quartered, your parts were sent to the corners of the kingdom. One limb nailed to a village gate, another over a marketplace, your torso rotting beneath the castle walls. This wasn't barbarism, it was deliberate. Your body became a message scattered across the map. The church sometimes intervened. If you confessed before death, they might allow burial in unconsecrated ground. But even that was rare. Most criminals were dumped in mass graves, shallow, unmarked, forgotten. or worse, left for the scavengers. Because denying a person burial wasn't just cruel, it was spiritual damnation. It denied the soul peace, and people believed that deeply. Even when the body was removed, the memory remained. Locals remembered the smell, the crows, the way the bones stuck out from the gibbet cage in the fog. It became part of the town's story. This is where he hanged. This is where her head fell. The corpse faded, but the lesson stayed. Families weren't allowed to collect remains. Mourning was discouraged. Grieving a criminal was seen as disloyalty. To weep was to question the justice that placed them there. And questioning the system? That was a step closer to becoming the next display. In the Middle Ages, your body didn't belong to you. Not in life, and certainly not in death. Especially when the state decided you were worth more as a corpse than a cautionary tale. There was no paperwork, no digital trail, no fingerprint database. In the Middle Ages, if you were guilty of a crime, or even just accused, your body became the record. And that record? It traveled with you for the rest of your life. Burned, branded, carved, scorched into skin. You didn't get a second chance. You got a scar. Branding was the most common. A hot iron pressed against the cheek, forehead, hand, or chest. Letters burned into flesh. T for thief, V for vagrant, F for forger. Sometimes symbols, a cross, a crown, a fleur-de-lis. Not for honor, but as a permanent stain. Your sin seared into visibility. And there was no hiding it. You couldn't grow a beard to cover your forehead. You couldn't wear gloves in the summer without arousing suspicion. Branded criminals were treated like walking warnings. They were watched, shunned, mocked, or worse. A branded man was refused work. A branded woman was refused safety. Their bodies screamed before their mouths could open. But branding wasn't the only form. Ear cropping was another. A slice taken from the side of your head. The court might lop off one ear for the first offense, the second for another, leaving you visibly judged. And if you returned to court a third time, with no ears to give, that was your neck next. Scars became sentences. The village knew them, the church remembered them. The Lord's men checked for them. They weren't just proof of guilt, they were proof of identity. Criminals didn't need names, they had marks. And those marks spoke louder than any defense ever could. If you tried to hide them, covered your hands, wore a hood, avoided the sun, that was considered suspicious behavior. More cause for interrogation, more punishment. And if you were caught tampering with your scar, that alone could earn you another. Some people tried to escape their pasts, ran to new towns, claimed new lives. But the scars always followed. They were examined at gates, at markets, at marriages. Branded criminals were seen as cursed, doomed to fail again, and society made sure they never forgot it. In the Middle Ages, you didn't just live with your crimes. You wore them. You became them. And no matter how much time passed, your skin told the story. You didn't need to commit a crime to be punished in the Middle Ages. All it took was a whisper, a grudge, a wrong glance, or someone with more power and fewer morals. False accusations weren't rare. They were a weapon, a tactic, a death sentence masquerading as justice. The system didn't require proof. It required momentum. One person said your name. Another nodded. Maybe someone recalled seeing you near the scene, or dreaming something strange, or just didn't like the way you looked. That was enough. And once suspicion took root, it grew like wildfire. There were no lawyers to protect you, no investigators digging for truth, just the accused alone, standing before men who had already made up their minds. and defending yourself? That was suspicious. Why are you so desperate? What are you hiding? Why don't you just confess and spare us the trouble? In some cases, your only evidence was the absence of evidence, which was twisted into guilt. No one saw you steal the bread? Convenient. No one else has plague but you? Curious. Your neighbors don't like you? Telling. And once branded as guilty, the punishment came fast. Torture until confession. Public shame. Execution. No one apologized. No one reversed course. Even if your accuser admitted the lie, the court might ignore it to save face. Better one innocent punished than a justice system embarrassed. False accusations were often strategic. A way to seize property, silence a rival, control a woman, remove a peasant who owed too much or knew too much. Some towns ran on them. An accusation became currency, traded for favor and power. The church often backed it. The nobles encouraged it. The people watched it, whispered about it, and sometimes joined in. And even if you somehow survived, beaten, scarred, exiled, your life was over. The stain didn't wash off. People didn't forget. The words, "I heard he did it," echoed louder than any truth you could scream. You were marked, hunted, broken. Because in the Middle Ages, innocence wasn't protection. It was a liability, a brittle shield in a world that craved guilt and rewarded those who could invent it. You'd think that after centuries of floggings, burnings, beheadings, and brutal humiliations, the justice system might pause and ask, "Are we the baddies?" But no. In the Middle Ages, the law didn't evolve toward mercy. It evolved toward efficiency and spectacle. New crimes were added, old punishments were refined, tools became sharper, techniques more inventive. If anything, cruelty became codified. What passed for reform was often just a change in pace or method. Instead of punishing fewer people, they punished more people faster. Instead of reducing violence, they just made it more portable. Mobile pillories, portable gibbets, whipping posts on wheels. Some towns even established traveling judges who toured the countryside, doling out justice with the urgency of a butcher on market day. Legal language grew more specific, less to protect the accused and more to define exactly how to break them. Laws were written down in Latin or French, unreadable to the peasants they crushed. Vague phrases like disturbing the king's peace or muttering against the faith became all-purpose charges. They didn't narrow justice, they widened the net. And punishment? It got stranger. New devices emerged, new combinations of pain and shame. Torture chairs, iron maidens, the rack upgraded with foot rollers. Punishments were displayed with more ceremony, like theater. Justice became entertainment refined, less random, more deliberate, more rehearsed. The church contributed too. They expanded lists of sins, added rituals for penance that involved public lashings or barefoot pilgrimages across burning stone. Confessors were trained to pull deeper confessions. Inquisitions grew bureaucratic, paper trails lengthening behind each new accusation like a snake of fear. Even prisons evolved. Solitary confinement, darker cells, methods of starvation that could be drawn out for weeks. The goal wasn't to kill faster, it was to perfect suffering. A science of slow-motion justice, a philosophy of pain. Yet the illusion of progress remained. Rulers boasted about these laws as if they were modern innovations. They claimed they were making things fairer, more consistent. But consistent cruelty is still cruelty. A sharper axe isn't justice, it's just more efficient murder. So, yes, the law evolved, but not to help you. It evolved to crush you cleaner, quieter, and with less chance of resistance. You could be wrong. You could be guilty. You could be poor. But the one thing you could never be in the Middle Ages was defiant. Rebellion of any kind wasn't seen as courage. It was seen as treason, and treason didn't just kill you, it erased you. Speak out against a tax? Treason. Refuse to hand over your harvest? Treason. Assemble with neighbors to complain about the local lord? That's not community. That's sedition. In a world built on absolute power, rebellion wasn't just disobedience. It was an insult to God's order. Because kings ruled by divine right, and the church backed every crown with holy fire. The punishment for treason was the worst the system had to offer. Hanging, drawing, quartering, public flaying, execution by slow fire, your land seized, your family ruined, your name struck from records. Some were cursed in sermons, others had their homes burned to the ground so no one would remember where they lived. Because rebellion wasn't just punished, it was scorched out of history. Even ideas were dangerous. Suggest a new way of leadership? That was enough. Read a banned book? Whisper that the king was unjust? Someone would hear, someone would report. And once you were accused, the charge of undermining the realm didn't need much evidence. Treason lived in the shadows. It didn't need proof, it just needed paranoia. And so people stayed quiet, dreamed quietly, prayed for survival rather than change. And when someone did rise, a peasant who led a march, a priest who preached equality, a noble who sided with the poor, they were dealt with quickly, publicly, loudly. Their fall became a lesson. You are not bigger than the system. You are not allowed to question your suffering. The most chilling part? Treason was flexible. It changed with the ruler. What was loyal under one king became heresy under the next. Loyalty itself became a gamble. To live was to conform. To die was to imagine a better world and say it out loud. Rebellion wasn't noble, it was fatal, and the system made sure no one forgot what happened to those who dared to dream. This is it, the final walk, the space between the cell and the scaffold, between breath and silence. No more appeals, no more prayers, just footsteps and eyes, watching, judging, waiting. You might be marched at dawn when the sky still aches with gray, or at noon when the market is busiest and the square fills with villagers eager for the show. Guards flank you, chains rattle. Your legs are weak from hunger, your skin marked with bruises and cold. You're barefoot, or nearly. Your clothes hang loose, dirt-stained and torn. There's no dignity in this moment, only inevitability. Sometimes the clergy walks beside you, a priest murmuring last rites in Latin you don't understand. You nod anyway. You're not sure if it helps. Nothing does. You can barely hear him over your own heartbeat, thudding like a drum. Counting down. You glance at the crowd. You recognize faces. A neighbor, a butcher, a child you once helped across the road. Now they stare at you like they're watching someone already dead. The square comes into view, the scaffold, the post, the pit. Whatever fate awaits you, it's built of splinters and sweat. You can smell the blood from past executions. You can feel the dampness in the wood. You've become part of a ritual now. Another name in a long, unending line of examples. If you falter, the guards shove you forward. If you speak, they hush you. If you cry, the crowd watches closer. Some laugh, some cheer, some pretend to look away but keep peeking. Everyone says it's justice. Everyone acts like this matters. That this death will balance something. And maybe the worst part isn't the pain, it's the performance. Being paraded, degraded, erased, not in silence but in public. With drums, with cheers, with God watching, or so they say. Sometimes you're offered a final word, sometimes a drink, sometimes nothing at all. But even if you speak, your words are washed away by the wind, or smothered by the swing of a rope. The final walk is not about you. It's about the system reminding itself that it still controls who lives, who dies, and who gets remembered. And in the Middle Ages, remembrance was a privilege you no longer owned. By now, you've probably realized the truth. In the medieval justice system, freedom wasn't the goal. It was a myth, a distraction, a tale whispered to keep people obedient. Because once you entered this system, there was no clean exit. You were never getting out. Even if you were innocent. Even if you survived the torture, the accusations, the humiliation. Even if your sentence was commuted or your charges dropped. The damage was done, your name was ruined, your body marked, your soul exhausted. You were never seen the same again. You left prison, you were still watched. Branded? People still crossed the street. Pardoned? They whispered that you must have known someone, or known something. The community didn't forgive, it remembered, and in remembering, it kept you in the system, long after the chains were gone. Every part of justice was built to trap you. Poverty made you a suspect. Silence made you guilty. Mercy was rare, and when it came, it arrived like a cold wind. Too little, too late, and never enough to undo the damage. And what if you weren't poor? What if you were a noble? Even then, your safety hinged on loyalty, usefulness, timing. Fall out of favor, and the same courts that once applauded you would throw you into the fire. Because power didn't protect, it loaned. And loans, like lives, were collected harshly. The truth is, the medieval system didn't care who you were. Only what you represented, a tool, a threat, a lesson, a liability. Once marked, you weren't a person anymore. You were a symbol, a warning to others, a shadow in someone else's story. No one rose above it. Not for long, not without cost. The peasants, the merchants, the priests, even the kings. They all lived in fear of the same machine. Because it fed on people. It thrived on obedience. And it punished not just wrongdoers, but anyone who stood too tall, spoke too loudly, or simply stood in the way. So, if you were accused in the Middle Ages, your fate was never really a question. It was a countdown, a performance, a spiral. You didn't escape the system. You became proof it worked.